Please welcome Pamela Paul in conversation with Gordon Sauter.
I guess it's no mystery that on this stage I'm Gordon Sauter, and I am absolutely stunned by the size of the audience. I was going to say that this is probably the biggest accumulation of true book readers at this conference, and we're flattered you're here. I have a slight asthma problem, and if it gets complex, I'm turning the stage over to Ann Taylor Fleming. Please be here, Ann Taylor, there, back there, who used to be a writer for the New York Times Sunday magazine, did great profiles on Teddy Kennedy and Truman Capote. Is David Niven here? I really should turn the podium over to David Niven, who used to produce movies for Paramount in Europe and is one of the world's great raconteurs. If you give him the microphone, it's over, but whatever. I'm delighted you're here. I think it's marvelous that we have such a distinguished guest, such a significant role player in books in America. And I guess my first question is, did you grow up in a house with books?
You know, I didn't entirely grow up in a house with books because my parents were both readers, but we lived just a few blocks away from the public library, and it was across the street from the elementary school. And so anytime I asked for a book, my mother's answer would be, go to the library. And I did. I went there every day after school. This was back in the day when, even at the age of 7, you would walk to and from school by yourself, and I would camp out in the library all afternoon. It was much better than being at home, where I had 7 brothers and they all had control of the remote control, and there was, only Gilligan's Island and the Brady Bunch on. So I preferred a life in books, and I loved being in that library so much that I sort of assumed ownership of it, and I tried desperately to get a job in that library, and I asked multiple times, and I was routinely turned down every time I asked for a job. I offered to do it for free, but they still said no. I was only 10. And I've subsequently gone back and they've apologized. They feel bad. But we didn't have a lot of books in the home. Books to me were incredibly special. And I have to say, on a very superficial level, one of the best things about this job is all the free books. I'm like a kid in the candy store. I still can't get over that I can just take these books and they're mine.
Well, you went to Brown University. Mm-hmm. What did you do after Brown?
That's a very long story, but I went into Brown thinking that I would go into either advertising, which is what my mother did. She became an advertising copywriter the same year that Peggy did, in Mad Men. She has stories to tell too. But I thought that what she did was so clever. She would come home at night and she would have an assignment, say for Chiquita Banana, and she'd have to come up with taglines like, it's banana appeal, and she would just reel them off, and I thought I could do that. So I either wanted to do that or I wanted to go into publishing. And 4 years later, graduating, and I studied history there, I wanted to do the same thing. Now, I should say that secretly what I really wanted to do was be a writer, but that was like way too scary to even articulate fully to myself. And so I was interviewing for jobs after college graduation, or before graduation, in that sort of spring recruitment period. And I was in a room with a recruiter, and I was speaking to him, and I was saying, I really like Captain Crunch, but only when there are crunch berries, because you need the kind of tart to sort of offset the overwhelming sweetness. And I was, I had that situation where you have like a bird's eye view of yourself and you're looking down, and I was like, what are you talking about? Because the question he had asked me was, why do you want to work at Quaker Oats? And this was my really bad answer. And and so he said, like, many of us here at Quaker Oats really do like crunch berries too, but really, why do you want to work here? And I, said, you know what, I don't think I do, actually. And I walked out, and I ended up, after graduation, doing something that at the time, probably was more unusual than it is now. A lot of kids take gap years, and one of the Obama girls did it, and so it's sort of become more accepted. And they take it usually before college, but I did it after. And what I decided to do was I had this feeling that if I went into college knowing what I wanted to do, and I was leaving knowing what I wanted to do, and it was the same thing, that maybe I hadn't learned anything in school, that I hadn't been exposed to enough, and that perhaps I was only looking at options A through D, and I was not looking at options E through Z, and that it would behoove me to maybe explore some of the things that I had either assumed I wasn't interested in or didn't know anything about. And so I very deliberately decided to go somewhere that I didn't want to go, where I didn't know anyone, where I didn't have a job, where I didn't speak the language, where I wasn't the same religion or ethnic background. And the continent that I chose to do this on was Asia, because again, having a very insular upbringing, I'd only been to Europe before graduation when I studied abroad. I had only one thing that I knew about Asia, and that was that I was not interested in it. I had gone as a Girl Scout in second grade to a Benihana on a Girl Scout trip, and they had a big bowl of free crackers, and I ate like 1,000 of them and vomited everywhere. And after that, I was not interested in Asia at all. So I thought, okay, that's where I have to go. And I ended up getting a one-way ticket to a northern city in Thailand and living there for a year. And that's what I did.
You went to the New York Times as either the reviewer of children's books or the editor of children's books. What do parents want in a children's book? And how did that relate to your decisions as to what kind of books to put in the magazine?
So I came on board as the part-time children's books editor, which is, obviously you have to watch out for that person because she's going to like claw her way to the top, and no one suspected. But I came there, I had 3 children, and I loved children's books, and I still love children's books. And I really don't like it when people have disdain for children's books, when they say, well, that's just a children's book, because my answer is the children's books are the books that make us readers. And I think probably all of you in this room can think back, like, well, what was the first book that got me? And whether it was All of a Kind Family or, I Am a Bunny or Blueberries for Sal, like those are the books that bring us into the world of reading. So I think they perform a kind of magic. I'm lucky that I came into this role really during what I consider to be a golden age of children's books, and that at every level, from board books to picture books to middle grade to young adult, which didn't exist. Like when I was a teenager, you just read, V.C. Andrews' Flowers in the Attic, which was like about incest, because there weren't books for teenagers. The books have gotten much better, and so it really is an act of incredible triage. I would say that was the hardest thing about that job, is just how many great books that were out there that I wanted to bring to people. It felt to me, that job, like a mission and a passion, because books for me made me who I am, especially as a child. And they were so formative, and I wanted to be able to offer that to the readers of the New York Times. And I remember I came into this job, there'd only been 4 children's books editors before me. One of them was in the role for like 30 years. I felt such a responsibility, and I called my predecessor after a few months, and I said, I can't get all the books in, Julie. I can't do it. And she said, oh, no one expects you to. But I did feel that obligation. So when I was in that role, I also added a review that I wrote every week.
But how did you adjust your sense of what the good books were with a sense of what the audience might be seeking?
Well, so you have to remember a lot of things. There are a lot of constituencies, and there's every genre in children's books that there are in adult books, with the added factor that you have a huge range of age, that you're looking at 0 to 18. So a lot of it was just making sure I covered all of my bases, and that, if I had a science fiction thriller for a teenager, that I also had like a bunny book for a 3-year-old. And the other complicating thing with children's books is that it's not just about the text, it's about the art. So a lot of what we do what I did in this role is similar to what I do in my current role, overseeing all the books coverage at the Times, which is to remember that while things might not necessarily appeal to me, they're of interest to our readers. And so, you're always keeping in mind, well, who is the reader of the New York Times, and what are they looking for? And you don't want to be too institutional. We're not out there to please the librarians or the teachers.
Do you ever visualize a reader, the emblematic reader of the magazine? Could you describe a person who is the reader
of the New York Times Book
Yeah.
Review? I would say, no, because it reflects the diversity of not just this country, but we're a global paper now. Even the word paper is like verboten. I think I have a colleague in this audience. We're a news organization. But I do think that, in general, readers of the New York Times are curious about the world. And they're open-minded, and you want to be able to deliver and quench that curiosity. So, when I think about children too, especially, I think, kids don't know the world. They don't know what they don't know. So you're opening it up to them. And I do think that carries over into adult books. So, it's very easy to know everything that's on the bestseller list, and to know, okay, John Grisham has a new book coming out, and Zadie Smith or Michael Chabon has a new book coming out, or, Doris Kearns Goodwin. But what's harder, I think, for most readers is to discover the people they don't know, and to know, of all the books that are coming out of Africa right now, of all the books that are coming out of Nigeria specifically, which is the one, where do I go? And so again, it's performing that act of triage, which is really labor intensive. And there's a reason why we're the only freestanding book review left in the country, and the only newspaper that does anything remotely akin to what we do, which is that we are a true review. We don't the books come in, and they come in so many packages every day that we have to have 2 people open them up for us twice a day just to get through them. And that's just to the main mailbox. Then everyone else has their own mail to open. And we don't just go and look through them and cherry pick, okay, these are the ones we want to do. We actually go through all of them. Now, some of them we might look at for a nanosecond before we toss it into the, bin, but we are reviewing the landscape.
What is the process of a book coming into your organization? Mm-hmm. What are the steps that would lead that book to ultimately ending up in the magazine?
So it depends a little bit on the book. There are certain books that will go directly to a columnist. Like, we have a crime columnist. She's been with us since 1988. Many of you are probably loyal readers of Marilyn Stasio, and she has her own books. But in general, if a book comes into the main, and here I have to distinguish, we're talking about the book review. We also have 3 daily full-time critics at the Times. We have a reporting staff that does news and features, and all of that kind of comes under this desk. But if we're talking specifically about the book review, the book comes in, and then a team of senior editors will go through those books, and they will allocate them according to our staff of what we call preview editors. And they get mail cartons, usually 2 of them every 2 weeks or so, full of books, where they have to go through, say, 50 books a week. And yeah, it's a hard job. There is a reason why other places aren't doing this, because you need a really big staff, and they are reading all the time. And I think pretty quickly they divide their books into 3 piles. Definitely going to do it, definitely not going to do it, and ugh, I really have to go through these ones very carefully to determine, of let's say 10 different short story debut collections we have this month, maybe only one is going to get reviewed. So they pick out those, and once they determine which ones they're going to review and not review, they take the not reviews, which we call skips, and they send them to me. And then I will go through the skips, and I will determine, is there another way that we might cover this book? And they'll often say, this could be a great interview, or this is a new and notable, or this is something that we should maybe grouped together with some other books, and those go off to one side. And I sometimes, occasionally, will overturn something, and I'll say, I think that people are interested in this book, or has an angle, and why don't we reconsider it? Then they come in with, and then there are two other people who look at those skips who can also veto. So we really don't, if your book has been skipped or not reviewed, like, we know that we don't do it lightly. We really try to give everything its due consideration. And then once something is decided for review, the previewer will bring those books in and meet with me and a team of senior editors, and they'll present each book. And they'll tell us what the book is and why they think it merits a review. And they'll come in with a list of people that they think would be good reviewers. And that, the hardest decision that we make and the most important decision we make is which books to review. That's the most important thing. The most fun and the most creative and the most exciting is who should review it. And so once we get to the determination that we're going to review this book and we figure out the length, and then we talk about who it's going to be. And that person, the previewer, will have ideas, and I will have ideas, and other people in the room will have ideas, and eventually we'll come up with a list and an order in which to ask people. And some people say, but doesn't everybody say yes? And they don't say yes, and sometimes they say yes, but we say no, which is to say that we are a news organization, so we are vetting for conflict of interest. So anyone who has been reviewed by that person before, or has reviewed that person for us before, or has ever reviewed that person negatively is out. If they have the same agent, the same editor, out. If they've ever been on a panel together and jousted in public, out. Because you don't want anyone to look at a review and say, I don't trust that review. You can dislike that review, you can disagree with it, but you shouldn't distrust it. And so we do try to make sure that no one is coming in there with an agenda. Now, it's not to say that, book criticism is the same as news reporting. It's not entirely objective. No, it shouldn't be. You have to have an opinion. Otherwise, it's just a book report. So they should be bringing some kind of point of view, but they shouldn't have an axe to grind. And then occasionally we'll ask people, and they'll, it's not their full-time job to write for us for the book review. We have our staff critics, and they have to do it. But, if I go to Bill Clinton or Colson Whitehead or, and I was going to say Toni Morrison, but she's dead, and she never said yes, sadly. Although she did review for us back in the 80s. If I go to them and say, I'd love for you to review this book, they might say, I've got something else to do. I'm busy. Stephen King doesn't always say yes. He has, he writes. So eventually we come down and we settle on the person to review.
Is there who has been the most frequent reviewer in your tenure of books? I mean, is there somebody who has done a significant number?
Well, one of the things that I did when I came into the book review, and in particular once my job was expanded in 2016 to oversee the critics, is to really think hard about what is it that makes the book review special and unique within the Times and also out there in the world. And to my mind, that's that you never know who's going to review a book. So the byline that I never want to see in the book review is, so-and-so is a frequent contributor to the New York Times book review. And when my team knows that if they come in and they suggest someone that's really familiar, I'll say, when did that person last review? So now they come in armed, and they'll say, they didn't do anything since April 2017. But I think that what we're doing is really, there's so many people out there who can bring so many perspectives on books. I don't want to see the same people in there. I don't think other people do. When I was doing the children's books job, I thought my challenge that I set for myself, and I only had that job for 2 years before I came into this one, was I want to stop anyone who's going to flip past the kids' pages because they don't care about kids and they don't care about kids' books and they don't have any kids, and force them to stop. Force them to stop because it's Simon Callow, the great Shakespearean actor, reviewing a children's book about Dickens. I want to give people a reason to read, and that is often about the reviewer. And again, to differentiate it from the daily paper, where you have Dwight Garner, Pearl Sagal, and Jennifer Salai, and before that, Michiko Kakutani and Janet Maslin as staff reviewers, you know who you're going to get. And that's a different experience, right? Because you grow to follow those reviewers, you know their taste, you grow to trust them. Book review, it should be a surprise.
How many books do you read?
I'm a slow reader. It's the bane of my... I know it's true. It really is true. And I'm very upset and jealous of my colleagues because I have a lot of really fast readers. And I'm a selfish reader, and I feel very lucky because I'm a selfish reader in that I don't want to read what I don't want to read. I want to, I want to pick my books. And one of the benefits of being in this job in particular is that I have a team that's going through them all before me, and so I gather a lot of information before I decide whether I'm going to devote my time to reading something. Hopefully, by the time I get there, I stick with it.
How do you find time to write?
I write on the train. So I have like I have no time. This is like so nice to be out here this week. I'm sort of doing my day job on the side, but you know I oversee a full department at the Times, and that's full time. And I have 3 children, and they're full time. And so I write on the train. And it's a 38-minute train ride each way, give or take. And I have a book due in October, so it's terrifying.
Do you read Kindle or hardcover?
I only read hardcover. I think, I understand the appeal of Kindle, and especially if you need to see things in larger type, and I'm moving into that demographic. I understand the appeal, but I really love a physical book so much. I love them so much that I have multiple copies of certain books just because, I want the UK cover and the American cover. And I'm, as I said, extremely acquisitive when it comes to books. So I will often see, something out in paperback and grab it and realize, oh, I still have the hardcover at home, and then I determine which format I really want to read, and sometimes it's toggling between the two. I also, I'm on screen all day at work. That's my job. I'm on the computer constantly, and so at the end of the day, I kind of want a break, and I want to fully immerse myself. And I do find that even if I have my phone sitting next to me and it's turned down, it's there, and it's got stuff. Little pings and notifications. So I need to be fully away from that screen experience and fully immersed in the book.
How have you guided your children into reading?
Well, I've written a whole book about that with my children's book editor, my current children's books editor, Maria Russo. But it would have surprised me if they hadn't become readers. One of the things to remember about kids, and I think this is one of the challenges, is that every kid is a different kind of reader, and a lot of the challenge is to opening up the world of books to them in such a way that allows them to find their own path. This is one of the reasons why people think that, one of the reasons why boys read less often than girls, and they do, and it's disturbing, and there are a number of reasons why, but boys to a significant extent say in surveys that reading is not a favorite leisure activity relative to girls, and they choose to read for leisure less frequently over the summer. Now, a couple of interesting things about that. One is both boys and girls say that they see their fathers reading less frequently than their mothers, and both men and women read less frequently to their sons than they do to their daughters. And so and I have a girl and 2 boys, and I would say that my boys actually are, I hope my daughter's not listening, but are more voracious readers than my daughter. She's a reader too, but she's 14, so there are other things for her to do. But one of the reasons why that is, and one of the reasons why that's changing, is that many of us think of books in the way that probably a lot of you do and that I do, which is a beautiful narrative, a lot of great type. But boys don't always gravitate towards that. They like visual books, they like fact books, they like joke books, they like photography books. My youngest likes to sit and read a science encyclopedia, which is I would rather put a gun to my head than sit down and read a science encyclopedia. And I think that now there's a growing recognition that there are different kinds of readers, but it used to be that if a boy got up and sort of crawled around the room or wandered around while the person was reading aloud, the parent would assume well, they're not into it. And it's no, they're actually into it. They just need to move around too, and they're listening, and they'll come back when they're curious to see what was in the picture. So, for me, it was a lot of experimentation. And obviously, once I had the job of children's books editor, I then had the great benefit of coming home every day with a huge tote bag of books. And still to this day, when I walk in the door, my kids say, "What have you brought home?" It's not "How was your day, Mom?" It's "What do you got?" And I think, again, part of empowering kids around what they read is to to allow them to have taste and opinion, and not to say like, oh, you're reading a graphic novel, that's not a real book, or like that book's so stupid. You just have to respect them.
Changing the topic somewhat, we're all aware and some of us quite concerned about the decline of newspapers that can't find advertising. What is the advertising picture for your magazine? Up, down,
So we really do have a church-state divide at the Times, and I cannot pay attention to that. I'm not directly involved in advertising in the same way that we're not directly involved with the opinion section of the paper. It really is siloed, and that's for a reason that, and even when a conflict comes up, for example, they've scheduled this page to advertise and it's opposite the review of the book, there's someone else, there's a managing editor who will untangle that process so that I don't, so that just doesn't affect me. Obviously, I like people to advertise in the book review. I believe that advertisements work as a reader because I look at advertisements. I think that for, a lot of people, for me as a reader, it's very informative to sort of see in the aggregate some of the other reviews that are blurbed in an advertisement, and that can often sway me as a reader.
Well, going to that area, are you aware of any internet book review organizations that you think have any merit?
I think a lot of places have merit, but it does trouble me that that there aren't more news organizations doing what we do, because we really take it seriously. And when people think that, a review by a reader online, anonymous, sort of is a review, then that's disturbing. Now, it's not to say that it's not without merit. I think it's great that people are going online and writing their opinions. But, any author has the experience of like having their book go up on Amazon and then seeing like a bunch of one-star reviews of like people who haven't read the book but didn't like the cover, or the book arrived like with a cover broken from Amazon, and so they give it 1 star. And that like some kid who you like insulted in 3rd grade is like in there being like, so I wish there was more. I wish there were more competition. It keeps us on our toes to know, like, if we want to get a certain reviewer for a book, to know that like the New York Review and the New Yorker are also maybe asking that person, and it still happens. We just recently tried to get someone, and he was doing it for the New York Review, and I think that's like healthy, to have that sense of competition.
A personal question. You, in the magazine, you ask authors, who would you invite to your literary dinner party? And I have found that so interesting to ask readers, who would you invite?
Well,
and as they go through the list, you're suddenly getting an insight into them. Who would be at your party?
Well, that answer depends on when you ask me. I was asking like recently, the last time I was asked this question, I named a bunch of really witty people who would like drink a lot and say things and sort of, maybe jostle each other a bit in the 20th century. But lately I've been in a very 19th century mood. I find it deeply therapeutic to go into like a 19th century novel, and think about their problems as opposed to the issues of today. So I'm going to give you a 19th century answer, which is based on some novelists that I've read recently. And so I'm going to say William Dean Howells, who is, Mark Twain's best friend, but I won't invite Mark Twain because that's too obvious. George Eliot, who's just one of my favorite writers, and I would love to know what she actually, the way she spoke and comported herself in public. And then, and Wilkie Collins, because I only recently discovered him a couple of years ago, and he was friends with Charles. Charles won't be there, but he can talk about him. Charles Dickens. So that's my answer.
What are the top 5 books on your night table?
So I'll tell you what I'm reading now, and I'll tell you what I just finished. I just finished the last 3 books I read. I'm going to say 4, actually. I'm going to cheat. I'm doing 6. So I I really loved, I just read a book that I finished in LA before I came here by Shoshana Zuboff called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It's a huge book. It's coming out in paperback. But she is a professor emeritus from Harvard Business School, and it's a really kind of deep history of the technology industry and the way in which it's primarily affected things like privacy. So I strongly recommend that. It looks very intimidating. I promise you it's actually quite accessible. Now I'm going to dumb it down a little. Well, no, I'm not yet dumb. I recently read a really great one-volume biography of Richard Nixon by John Farrell, and that came out. It was written prior to the 2016 election, but for anyone interested in impeachment, there are the obvious parallels. But it's also just a remarkable, even-handed one-volume history of this person who is so incredibly complicated. I have a habit of reading memoirs by people before I read biographies, and I often find it interesting to see the way that they depict their own lives, and then go back and see like what it maybe a more balanced perspective might look like. So I'd read books by Nixon, and I'd read some books that in which he figured, like the Bob Caro's Johnson biographies, but I had not read a book about him. And there's so many interesting things, and I'll just say one, which is that I had not known, and many of you probably know this, but that he grew up, he was a family, 4 boys, and they were fed by the family cow. That's how they got their milk, and the cow must have been tubercular, but the father believed strongly in raw milk, didn't pasteurize it. And one day, one of his younger brothers, his most favorite brother, came home and said he didn't feel well, and 24 hours later, he was dead. And then his older brother became tubercular, and his mother took that boy off to sanatoriums and would leave Richard Nixon and one other brother and his dad alone at home, sort of eating out of cans for dinner at night. So I thought that was really interesting, and I mentioned it recently to the novelist Thomas Malin, who has written a novel about Watergate, and he said that he thought that was the most important factor that sort of shaped Nixon's life. So I really loved that. I'm giving you long answers. I just read a book, a picture book, which I highly recommend. It's a reissue. It's called I'll Fix Anthony by Judith Viorst. I think it came out in 1968. And it's the kind of picture book that in a way isn't really written that often anymore, in that it really allows for very strong negative emotions for kids. So it's about a 5-year-old boy, and he's like, when I'm 6, I'm going to fix Anthony, who's his older brother and obnoxious. And it's just, it's for all ages. Like, everyone has some kind of Anthony in their life they want to fix. And so I recommend this picture book. And the book that I'm reading right now, I'm reading 2 books. One is a thriller called Mr. Nobody by Catherine Steadman, who wrote a thriller that came out last year and was recommended recently by one of my colleagues at the time, Sarah Lyle, who wrote about sort of the best winter thrillers, and she persuaded me. So that's just a really fun page turner. The author is an actress on Downton Abbey, apparently, which I've never seen because, as I said, I have no time to watch TV, but apparently is quite good. And then I'm reading a really great book, which I just learned from our own By the Book interview with Charles Yu, who's a science fiction novelist, is also reading, called Untangled by Lisa Damour. And so this is a book about raising teenage girls. And as I said, I have a 14-year-old, so that's self-explanatory.
A big story today, not just in the book world, but in the broader society, is the issue of appropriation. Would you define appropriation, and what is your response to it?
So I'm assuming you're bringing this up because of the controversy over American Dirt. I feel like I should just give a little primer in case people are like, what kind of dirt? So American Dirt is a novel written by a woman named Janine Cummings. She has written several books before. She had written a memoir about a terrible situation in which members of her family were killed one night, and then one of her brothers was sort of left for dead but survived. And this is a novel that came out with a lot of fanfare from its publisher. There's a big book trade event that occurs every year in New York called Book Expo. And when I was at Book Expo last year and I was talking to booksellers about what they were excited about, the answer that everyone gave, absolutely without exception, was American Dirt. They read it, they loved it, they were super excited about it. And the novel is a book about a Mexican bookseller, educated, upper class, or thriving professional class bookseller, and her son who flee a gun shooting that has to do with the drug cartel, cross over the border and come to America. So it's a border immigration story. And the author is, she has a Puerto Rican grandmother, but she is white. And so the controversy has been that people are saying, does this person have the right to write about Mexican Americans when she herself is not Mexican American? And I think part of that, their unhappiness, this community, comes from the fact that they feel like their voices are not represented in the publishing world. It is certainly true, and there was a study that came out this week, that the publishing world is largely white in terms of the people that work there in positions of power. And there is definitely a movement towards diversity and publishing more diverse voices, but there's a movement also, a smaller movement called Own Voices, where people say that only people whose experience, only people with a certain experience should be writing about that experience. I would say that I think that books are, I hope, one of the most open-minded, broad-minded acts of imagination and ventriloquism and magic out there, and that, anyone can read about anything. Anyone can have an opinion as a reader about anything. Many people can have an opinion as a critic about anything. And people can write about anything. Can we all do it well? Probably not. I'm in awe of anyone who can imagine their way into the voice of anyone other than themselves. Anyone. I could not write a fictional book about someone who was like essentially me, but like with, brown eyes. Like I have no imagination whatsoever. I did just write a picture book from the perspective of a cat, and that hasn't come out yet. And so that was a leap of imagination, but there are not a lot of words, and I've lived with cats all my life, and I feel like I have some insight. I couldn't do a dog. I will say that right now. But I do think that, one of the books that I admired most last year, which was one of our 10 best, was Disappearing Earth by Julia Phillips. And Julia was a Fulbright scholar in Kamchatka, which is a peninsula. The Risk players know this, right? Kamchatka, in Siberia. And she entered into the perspective not only of Russian immigrants, because everyone in Kamchatka who's Russian is actually an immigrant, even though it is part of Russia, and the perspective of people in those tribes. And I thought she did a beautiful job, and she did her research, and I didn't doubt at any moment that I was getting something totally rich. Now, I'm certain that there are people maybe in those tribal groups, those Siberian tribal groups, who might say, like, well, she didn't really capture this, that, and the other. But for me as a reader, I was brought along. And so I do think that we wouldn't know some of these stories otherwise. I think that there's the perspective that you come from as a teller of stories is one aspect of what makes a book good, but there are so many other things. There's the language, there's the sentence, there's the plot, there's the structure, there is the originality, and so there's so much that can make a book good or bad, and the perspective or the background experience of the person telling it is one component, but not the only one.
Thank you. That's quite illuminating. You are quite compelling. We talked about 15 minutes for questions, and we've missed that, but we have time for a couple of questions. Yes?
What is the time frame for the process from the time a book comes in the mail to the time you actually finish and publish?
So the question is, about like what is the time frame from the point a book comes into our office to like when it goes out. In an ideal scenario, we are getting that book in a good 3 to 6 months ahead of time, and we are giving the reviewer a good 4 weeks to read and write about the book, and then we get it in a month ahead of time so that we can then weigh in and make a decision and schedule it for print and online for the pub date, so that we want to have it out there the day it comes out, so that when people hear about a new book, they can put in the title and find our review, and then in print where it makes sense as sort of part of that overall package. Now that fantasy, that scenario doesn't always come true, because there are things like embargoed books, books where, especially in this current political climate, we don't get the book until the last minute because it might have news revelations. And so that shortens our timeline quite a bit. And we're lucky to have 3 staff critics who are, have to do the job. And they can do an all-nighter if necessary, and they're very good at doing that. I think, Michi was legendary for it, and we have critics now who will do it even. It's hard. But that's generally the timeline.
Yes.
Okay, so there were 2 questions. The first one, I said that I don't have any competition. Is the New York Review a competition? I didn't say we don't have any. We don't have enough. I mean, I would love for every newspaper in this country to still have a vibrant book page, at the very least, if not a freestanding book review. The Washington Post killed its freestanding book review in 2009, folded it into Outlook, San Francisco Chronicle in 2005. I do consider the New York Review to be competition, if not for necessarily the exact same readership or the same scale, certainly for reviewers. So for me, in my capacity, that's significant. And the second question was about whether or not we ever kill a review, reject a review, revise a review. So the way that we think about it is we never change anyone's opinion. That's their opinion on the book. But we do edit it for clarity, we edit for time style, we edit for voice. We do need to make sure that they factually back up every contention that they make. It goes into that issue of trust. So we not only fact check direct quotes, but if somebody says, oh, so-and-so was walking down the street on a rainy May afternoon, we check, was it raining? Was it May? Were they not running or not walking? And we make sure that every single thing is accurate. And we also make sure, there are instances where my least favorite thing is to get a review in and to be like, did they like the book? I can't tell. You have to issue judgment. It's not a book report. So I will often, when I do a top read, say, they need to weigh in. I have no idea what this person thinks. So that's probably my most significant.
Have you lost friends because of reviews?
Well, my husband said to me something very illuminating when I got this job, which is he said, it's depressing too. He said, well, from now on, you can't believe anything anyone says to you that's nice. And I was like, really? And he's, yeah, no, because everyone either wants to write a book or has a book or is a friend with a book. But I was like, what if it's super persuasive and very specific? And he said, yeah, no, you can't believe them. The corollary to that is that, anyone who says anything mean, I understand. I think it's an advantage coming into this job, having written a book myself and written several books and gotten negative reviews. And I know how horrible that is. It feels dreadful. But I also know that I've seen 2 of my predecessors in this job and become gradually feeling sometimes very oppressed by the feeling that everyone is either, angry or resentful or hurt or, ready to kill you. But as soon as they leave the job, they're fine and nobody cares. So
Professionally, where do you go from here? You're at the top of that game now. Is there another place for you to go? Running a publishing house, something like that?
I love where I am so much right now, and I find it so constantly changing and challenging that I have no desire to go anywhere, because there are always new books and there are always new authors, and I'm always discovering things about reading that I hadn't known. There are certain genres that I've only started to explore very recently, science fiction being one of them. There's just a lot I haven't read, and there's always new stuff. And I also have to say I feel extremely lucky to work at the New York Times, which in my opinion is the greatest news organization in the world. And if they suddenly said we want you to do something else here, I'd probably be maybe a little less happy, but at first. But when I was the children's books editor and I got this job, my kids considered me to have been demoted, and I, and I really missed that job. But I kind of know once I had it, I was happy to be where I was.
Well,
so.
we're running out of time here, and at some point somebody will come and throw us from this little stadium here. You've done a delightful job. It's just been such a pleasure sitting here with you.
Thank you so much.
And I hope you come back in the future and join us again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you.